Hello and hi everyone. In this class, I am going to explain various types of shares. That is, the different types of shares are deferred shares, equity shares, and preference shares. Various kinds of shares are deferred shares, equity shares, and preference shares. In the last class, we have seen the types of shares in detail. What are the different types of shares? And in that one, we have seen deferred shares, various types of shares and deferred shares. So the deferred shares are called as the founders shares. The deferred shares are the founders shares. Then generally a public limited company arrange capital by issuing shares. The companies requires two kinds of capital, that is fixed capital and working capital. Okay, in the last class I have explained it very clearly. The joint stock companies requires fixed capital and working capital. The fixed capital for the purchase of building machinery, etc. And the working capital requirement is to meet day-to-day business activities. Okay, so this will be the companies arrange, or the capital requirement is for long term, medium term and short term capital. Long term, medium term and short term capital. The joint stock company issues shares. Joint stock companies issues shares to procure long term capital. So the long term capital is usually more than 10 years. That is for the purpose of purchasing building machinery, etc. And the medium term capital is the time between 5 to 10 years. Okay, this is for modernization of buildings or repairings of machinery, etc. And the short term capital requirement is 6 to 2 years, 6 months to 2 years time to meet day to day expenditure or to purchase raw materials, etc. To purchase raw materials, etc. Short term capital. Shares are the best source for long term financial resources. Shares are the best source for long term financial resources. Shares are the best source for long term financial resources. And shares can be repaid only at the time of winding up of a company. Okay, so there are different types of shares, and these shares are the best sources. These shares are the best source to procure long term capital. Okay, so shares can be different categories. Share can be different types. preference shares, equity shares, and deferred shares. So in the last class I have clearly explained what is this deferred shares. What is this deferred shares? So deferred shares are the founders shares. Some shares are allotted to the promoters or founders of the company. Those shares are called as deferred shares. So the features of deferred shares are the capital or the dividend is paid to the deferred shareholders after payment of the equity and preference shareholder. After the payment of equity and preference shareholder, and the capital repayment, the capital back to the deferred shareholders will be at the time of winding up of the company will be the last priority, that is the payment after the payment of the after payment of the equity and preference shareholders. This I have explained it clearly. Okay, so the Indian Companies Act 1956 prohibited the issue of deferred shares by a public limited company from 1st April 1956. Okay, the next one, equity shares. In this class I am going to explain the new topic. Okay, in this class the new topic I am going to explain is equity shares, preference shares, and the types of preference shares. Equity shares, preference shares, and the types of preference shares. Okay, so the first one, deferred shares, we got an idea about deferred shares, right? The second one is equity shares. Generally we already know, or everyone knows about, the companies issue shares to the general public, the people who are interested to invest their money in the company, they can purchase the shares. Okay, so this type of shares are called as equity shares. This type of shares are called as equity shares. Okay, so these shares are called as ordinary shares. These shares are called as ordinary shares. Equity shareholders do not enjoy any special rights. Equity shareholders do not have any special rights. They are entitled to vote at the general meeting of the company. Voting rights are based on the principle of one share, one vote. Okay, so the equity shares are called as ordinary shares, and the equity shareholders doesn't have any special right. The equity shareholders do not have any special right. The equity shareholders do not have any special right based on participation of vote, one share. The equity shareholders get dividend after the payment of dividends to preference shareholders and debenture holders. So here one main important point to be remembered is, so before that, in the last class, the last one, we have noted one point, that is the deferred shareholders will receive the dividend or the capital back in case of winding up of a company. So after receiving the dividend of the equity and preference shareholder. So here in case of equity shareholders, okay, when compared to this equity shareholders and preference shareholders, so the priority is given to preference shareholders. The priority is given to preference shareholders. The equity shareholders or the equity shares are called as ordinary shares. Equity shares are called as ordinary shares. So, out of the profits of the company at the year end, first the dividend is distributed. The first dividend is distributed to the preference shareholders. Okay, the interest is paid. The interest is paid to the debenture holders. Okay, and the dividend is paid to the preference shareholder. Then next priority is given to the equity shareholders. Equity shareholders, and the last priority goes to the deferred shareholders, are called as promoters. Deferred shareholders are nothing but promoters. Okay, so here the equity shareholders get dividend after payment of dividend to preference shareholders and debenture holders. So when compared to this deferred equity and preference shares, in dividend point of view, so the first dividend priority distribution priority is given to preference shareholder. Then afterwards second priority will be to the equity shareholders. Then the last priority given to the deferred shareholders. This is the main important point we have to remember. So because the equity shares are called as ordinary shares, these are called as ordinary shares. They doesn't have, the equity shareholders doesn't have any special right, right. So this is about equity shareholders. And the remaining, in the event of winding up of a company, they will get their capital only after preference shareholders are paid back their capital. In the event of winding up of a company, they will get their capital only after preference. So here, in case of dividend distribution, the first priority goes to preference shareholder. Then the dividend will be paid to the equity shareholder. And in case of winding up of the company also, in case of winding up of the company also, the priority, the first priority will be to the preference shareholders. The first priority will be to the preference shareholders. Then after paying back their share capital to the preference shareholder, if any amount is left over, then that amount will be distributed to the equity shareholder. Then if the amount is left over, then the payment will be made to the deferred shareholders. Okay, so this is the procedure of paying dividend or capital back in case of winding up of a company in a joint stock company. If the business is successful, they get dividend. The rate of dividend is not fixed. Here equity shareholders equity shareholders get dividend out of the profits of the company in a year. So the dividend is not fixed. The dividend is not fixed. Okay. So it may change. The dividend may change because it depends on the profit. It depends on the profit the business may get. So the profit will be changed year to year. Okay, so that point, that is also important point. Hence the dividend on these changes with the forfeitures of the company and upon the recommendations of board of directors. Okay, so then the next point, if the business proves successful and yields handsome profits, the equity shareholders will get higher dividend. The equity shareholders will get higher dividends. Okay, here the point is the dividend is not fixed. Here the point is the dividend is not fixed. The dividend is not fixed. It means the rate of dividend, depends on the succession. The rate of dividend depends on the successful execution or business successful running the business. Okay, if the company is running very good, the company is getting more and more profits, generally the rate of dividend is high. Generally the rate of dividend will be high to the equity shareholders. So here the point is that the rate of dividend is not fixed, fixed. Then, but if a company does not earn enough, they may not receive any dividend at all. Okay, so here the rate of dividend is not fixed. And one more point is, if the company is not getting any profit, the company is not getting any profit, any kind of profit, the company is not getting any kind of profit. So in that case there is no dividend to equity shareholders. There is no dividend to equity shareholders. Thus they share in the prosperity of the company and also bear the risk of uncertainty. Here the equity shares are called as, equity shareholders are the real owners of the company. Equity shareholders are the real owners of the company, and these are called as ordinary shares. Okay, these are called as ordinary shares and they doesn't have any special right. The equity shareholders doesn't have any special right. Okay, so one share one vote in the meetings, one share one vote in the meetings. And the rate of dividend is not fixed. The rate of dividend is not fixed to the equity shareholders. It depends upon the successful business running of the business, successful running of the business. Okay, so a business is getting good profits, more and more profits, huge profits. So in that case the equity shareholders may get higher rate of dividend, higher rate of dividend. Okay, if the business is in loss, in that case there is no dividend to the equity shareholders, equity shareholders. Okay, that is the rate of dividend is depends on the successful running of the business. The rate of dividend depends on the successful running of the business. Okay, this is about the equity shares or equity shareholders. The next one is preference shares. Preference shares, here the name itself is saying preference. The name itself is saying preference, means somewhat preference is there, somewhat preference is there to this preference shareholders compared to other shareholders, that is equity shareholders or deferred shareholders, compared to other shareholders, that is equity shareholders or deferred shareholders. Okay, so here the word we have to understand is preference. So preference is nothing but priority. Preference is nothing but priority, giving priority. It means that compared to all three types of shares, deferred, equity and preference, okay, in these three kinds of shares the preference will be given to the preference shareholders. The preference will be given to the preference shareholders. Those which carry preference over other classes of shares in the payment of dividend and repayment of capital at the time of winding up of company. Okay, so here what is preference? What kind of preference will be given to the preference shareholders over the deferred shares and equity shares? Here the case is the rate of dividend. The rate of dividend, that is the rate of dividend means the amount of dividend. Okay, paying the rate of dividend, that is the dividend first, okay, distributed the dividend. The dividend will be distributed and given priority to preference shareholder, then after equity shareholders, and then finally deferred shareholders. Okay, so here we have to observe one point, that is the dividend. In distributing the dividend, in distributing the dividend, okay, that the preference will be given to the preference shareholders. The preference will be given to the preference shareholders. Preference shareholders. Then afterwards equity shareholders. Then afterwards deferred shareholders. So in case of paying capital back, that is in case of winding up of a company, the capital will be paid back. Okay, so in that case also, in that situation also, the first priority goes to the preference shareholders. The first priority goes to the preference shareholders. Okay, this shareholder enjoys preference. These shareholders enjoys preference. Preference enjoyed by these shareholders of is of two types. A. Preference as to fixed income or dividend out of every year's net profit of the company. So here the rate of dividend is fixed. The rate of dividend is fixed. Preference as to repayment of capital out of the residual assets of the company. Okay, the preference shareholders, the preference shareholders enjoy the preference. Okay, number one, preference as to fixed income or dividend out of the every year's net profit. So the preference shareholders get fixed dividend, fixed amount of dividend or fixed rate of dividend in the every year net profits of the company. In the every year net profits of the company. Okay, so here we can say the rate of dividend is fixed or the amount of dividend is fixed, and first priority will be given to the preference shareholder. Okay, the company first pays the dividend to preference shareholders, then the second priority is given to the equity shareholders. Here, compared to equity shareholders and preference shareholders, the rate of dividend is not fixed to equity shareholders. It depends on the profit the company may get. Higher profit gives to the higher rate of dividend to the equity shareholders. Here, the preference shareholders, in that case, equity shares, if the company gets higher profits, they have a chance to get higher rate of dividend. But if the company get losses, then the dividend won't be paid to the equity shareholders. And because the equity shares are called as ordinary shares, the equity shares are called as ordinary shares. So here in the preference shareholders, the preference is given to the preference shareholders, and the dividend is fixed. The dividend is fixed every year. Okay, the fixed rate of dividend is paid to the preference shareholder out of the net profits of a company. Then the second priority, second preference or advantage to the preference shareholders is that in case of winding up of a company, in case of winding up of a company, in case of winding up of a company, the capital or the share amount will be paid back from the residual assets of a company to the preference shareholders. The first priority will be given to the preference shareholders in paying capital back to the preference shareholders in case of winding up of a company. So after paying the capital back to the preference shareholders of the residual assets of the company, if the amount is left over, then the amount will be paid to the equity shareholders. Then last or final priority given to the deferred shareholders. And preference shareholders are paid dividends first out of profits of the company. The balance of profit is used for declaring dividend on ordinary shares. At the time of winding up of a company, capital of preference shareholders must be repaid first. These shareholders have no voting right in the company. These shareholders doesn't have any voting right in the company. Right. Here, one more important point is the equity shareholders have a right, one share, one vote. One share, one vote. They can participate in the company's meetings. The equity shareholders can participate in the company's meetings, and they have a voting facility. The equity shareholders have a voting right. One share, one vote. Here the preference shareholders doesn't have any right to vote. Any right to vote. The rate of dividend is fixed. The rate of dividend is fixed. Okay. The first dividend amount will be paid to preference shareholders out of the profits of the company, and the remaining profit amount is distributed to equity shareholders and deferred shareholders. Equity shareholders and deferred shareholders. Then in the case of winding up of a company, the first capital paid back the first capital paid back to preference shareholders. Okay, so all assets from the residual assets of the company, the capital back paid to preference shareholders, then after equity shareholders, then after deferred shareholders. Here one important point is to be remembered that the preference shareholder doesn't have any right to vote. They doesn't have any right to participate in the meetings. In the self, they doesn't have any right to vote. Okay, so that is the point to be remembered in case of preference shareholders. In case of preference shareholders. And there are different types of preference shares. There are different types of preference shares. Cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative preference shares, participating preference share, participating preference shares, non-participating preference share, non-participating preference shares, redeemable preference shares, redeemable preference shares, redeemable preference shares, and irredeemable preference shares, irredeemable preference shares, redeemable preference shares, irredeemable preference shares. There are different types of shares. That is, the different types of shares are the different types of preference shares are: number one, the different types of preference shares are the different types of cumulative preference shares. Here in case of equity shares and deferred shares, only deferred and equity. There are no other types. But in case of preference shareholders, they have other shares, 6 types of shares. Cumulative preference shares, cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative preference shares, cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative preference shares, participating preference shares, redeemable preference shares, irredeemable preference shares. Okay, these are all the types of preference shares. For each and every type, they have some features. For each and for example, if you say cumulative preference share, it have some features. Non-cumulative preference shares, it have some features. And redeemable preference shares have some features. Irredeemable preference shares have some features. Okay, like that, different types of preference shares are there. So this preference shares, I am going to the types of different types of preference shares I am going to discuss in the next class. Okay, to today's class we have to concentrate only on equity and preference. Equity and preference shares. What is an equity share and what is a preference share? Okay, so and the what are the differences between this equity, deferred and preference shares? Equity, deferred and preference shares, and the types of preference shares will be discussed in the next chapter. I will discuss the types of preference shares in the coming class. Next class will be discussed in the next class. Okay, so here once again I am explaining all these topics once again. So deferred shares are the founders shares. Deferred shares are the founder shares. Deferred shares are the founder shares. The deferred shares are allotted to the founder shares. Huh? These shares are held with promoters of the company. Promoters of the company. And the equity shares are the ordinary shares. The equity shares are the ordinary shares. The shares issued to the company. The company issues shares. The company issue a prospectus. We already know what is a prospectus. What is a prospectus? A prospectus is nothing but an invitation. A prospectus is nothing but an invitation or inviting the general public to invest the amount in the form of shares in the joint stock company. Okay, so here the general public may purchase either equity shares or preference shares. The general public may purchase only two kinds of shares. One is equity shares, another one is preference shares, depending upon their requirement, their knowledge. Okay, some people will buy equity shares, some people will buy equity share, some people will purchase preference shares. Each and every of these share, that is equity and preference share, having advantages and some disadvantages also, right? So the deferred shares are allotted to the promoters. Okay, those shares are held with the promoters of the company, and the dividend or the capital back to the deferred shareholders at the final priority. The last priority is given to the deferred shareholders in distributing dividend or capital back in case of winding up of a company. So here we have to understand and we have to concentrate on equity shares and preference shares. So the equity shares are called as ordinary shares. These shareholders are called as the owners of the company. These shareholders are called as the owners of the company. Okay, so the equity shares are called as ordinary shares, and these shareholders are called as the owners of the company. And the equity shareholders have a special right. The equity shareholders have a special right of vote. One vote, one share, one vote. They can participate in the company's meetings. They can participate in the company's meeting, and they have a right to vote. They have a right to vote. That is one vote, one share, one vote. The equity shareholders gets dividend higher rate of dividend compared to the preference shareholders. The equity shareholders get higher rate of dividend compared to the equity shareholders. So if the company or the business getting good profits, the company is getting good or more and more profits. So generally any company in the initial position, initial stages will get only a normal nominal profits. Okay. Whenever the company is growing up, whenever the company is growing up, generally the companies will get more and more profits. So in the equity shareholders will get higher rate of dividend, because the dividend of the equity shareholders is not fixed. The dividend of the equity shareholders is not fixed. But here, in case of preference shareholders, the dividend is fixed. In case of preference shareholders, the rate of dividend is fixed. Okay. So in the case of this equity shareholders, the rate of dividend is not fixed. It depends upon the profits, successful running of the business. Okay. When the company is getting huge profits, the first dividend is paid to the fixed rate of dividend, or the first in distributing the dividend, first priority is given to the preference shareholders. The first priority is given to the preference shareholders, because the rate of dividend is fixed to the preference shareholder in the net profits of the company. Then the remaining amount is distributed to the equity shareholders and deferred shareholders. In that distribution, the first priority will be given to the equity shareholders. Then afterwards, deferred shareholders. Okay. So the rate of dividend is fixed to the preference shareholders. Out of the net profit of the company, the dividend will be, the fixed rate of dividend will be paid to the preference shareholders. So then remaining amount will be equally distributed to the equity shareholders and deferred shareholders. In that, the first priority will be given to the equity shareholders, then after deferred shareholders. The equity shareholders have a right to vote. The preference shareholders doesn't have a right to vote. There are so many other different types of shares are available in preference shares. So there is no other share is available in equity shares. There is no other type of shares is available in equity share. Equity share is itself is only one type of share, that is equity share, that is called as ordinary share. They are the real owners of the company. They can participate in the company meeting. They have a right to vote. But they get dividend higher. The equity shareholders will get higher rate of dividend compared to the preference shareholders. Depends on the successful running of the business. Depends on the successful running of the business. This point we have to remember. Okay. But here the preference shareholders have a fixed rate of dividend. Okay. So it depends, it does not depends on the profits, the higher profits or the lower profits, higher profits or lower profits. Okay. Whatever the profits may be, okay, the fixed rate of dividend will be paid to the preference shareholders. That is the thing. And second, the capital is repaid back. The share capital repaid back in case of winding up of a company. The capital is repaid back in case of winding up of a company from the residual assets of the company. will be paid, will be given priority, first priority to the preference shareholders. Preference shareholders. The first priority given to the preference shareholders. Then afterwards, then afterwards equity shareholders and deferred shareholders. And the preference shareholders does not have any right to vote. The preference shareholders does not have any right to vote. And there are so many other types of options are available. The different There are so many other types of options are available in preference shares. There are so many other types of options are available in preference shares: cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative preference shares, participating preference shares, redeemable preference shares, and irredeemable preference shares. Redeemable and irredeemable preference shares. Okay, this is about today's class. I have clearly explained to you the various types of shares. Okay, I have clearly explained the capital requirement of a joint stock company in the last class and today's class. In the last class as well as today's class, that is long term, medium term, short term. And the company, the joint stock company, arrange or procures the long term capital by issuing shares. And there are different types of shares, that is deferred shares, equity shares, preference shares. I have clearly explained in the last class, that is what is a deferred share, what is a share, what are the features of shares, and what is a deferred shares. And in today's class, I have explained what is deferred share, what is equity share, this is the most important type of share, and what is preference share, and the differences between equity share, preference share, and deferred shares. The differences between deferred share, equity share, and preference shares. So here the main points we have to remember is equity share and preference shares. And there is another types of options are available in preference shares. There are some types of shares are available in preference shares. Okay, so tomorrow's class or in the next class I will explain very clear about this types of preference shares, so that we could be completed this long term procurement of financial resources of a joint stock company. Long term procurement of a financial resources of a joint stock company. And we will be clearly understood about we will be clearly understood about this types of shares, different types of shares. Okay, we will be clearly understood about different types of shares. Thank you.